ravens can really be noisy. But you know, ravens are very smart birds. But anyway, Elijah was one of my favorite prophets in the Old Testament. What do you look for in a favorite person or a favorite character? Is it youth or age, wisdom, boldness, strength or power? Maybe some of the characteristics you have. Or maybe it's characteristics you wish you had. How about weakness? Or maybe it's how God works through weaknesses. Actually, Elijah had most of these characteristics, and that's why I like his story. He was taunting of kings. He was bold and complaining to God. He healed people, and he actually changed the course of nature. So let's get started.
And now for Elijah, boldest of the prophets, part 1. This book was a great resource for me. It also showed how to apply what Elijah experienced into our time frame. This timeline might give you some idea where Elijah fits. King David, King Solomon, you can see those dates up there. And Elijah was the first prophet to show up on the timeline. Other prophets you may be familiar with, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, Jonah, they all came after Elijah. Now for some background. The Jewish nation, once united under David, has now been divided into kingdoms after the death of David's son Solomon. They were called the Kingdom of Israel, which was the northern kingdom, and the Kingdom of Judah, the southern kingdom. They each had their own kings and problems with foreign powers. A few of these kings were good, but most of these kings in both kingdoms were not very good. They wandered away from God, and many prophets tried to change that. So let's take a look at 1 Kings chapter 16. Ahab, son of Omri, began to rule over Israel in the 38th year of King Asa's reign in Judah. He reigned in Samaria 22 years, but Ahab, son of Omri, did what was evil in the Lord's sight, even more than any of the kings before him. And as though it were not enough to follow the sinful example of Jeroboam, he married Jezebel, the daughter of King Ethbaal of the Sidonians. And he began to bow down in worship of Baal. First Ahab built a temple and an altar for Baal in Samaria. Then he set up an Asherah pole. He did more to provoke the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than any of the other kings of Israel before him. As you can see, Ahab was a bad example. And his wife, Jezebel, was a strong personality and worshipped a foreign deity named Baal. Baal was a god of the Phoenicians, which was Jezebel's background. Baal was also associated with lightning, wind, rain, and fertility, and also required child sacrifice, usually the firstborn male. They arranged marriage between Ahab and Jezebel. This meant to bring security to Israel, but Jezebel was a priestess of Baal, and this meant bad news for the kingdom. You can see why no one names their daughter Jezebel. Now, 1 Kings chapter 17. Now Elijah, who was from Tishbe of Gilead, told King Ahab, "As surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, the God I serve, there will be no dew or rain during the next few years until I give the word." Elijah the Tishbite first appears in 1 Kings chapter 17. We don't know anything about Elijah up to now, but it may tell us something about his parents. Children were given a name of meaning. His parents must have been strong, believing Jews in the midst of bad times, because Elijah's name means, "My God is Yahweh." Ahab was king, and it says here, as you read earlier, more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of the kings before him. And Baal was a Canaanite god for rain, thunder, lightning, and dew. Elijah appears before Ahab and says there will neither be dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word. Now this was the first challenge of Baal, since Baal was the god of rain. This was a big statement, and obviously Elijah knew that God was behind the claim by the words he used, "The God I serve." But then God tells Elijah to leave and hide in the Kerith ravine. This place was not just for his preparation, but also for his protection, since Ahab was out to find him. He was public enemy number one. The more God uses you, the more you will need preparation. Who else needed time of preparation in the Bible that we know about? How about David? who waited 20 years from the time Samuel anointed him as king until he finally became king. Saul, later known as Paul, spent 3 years in the desert in Arabia after his conversion, and that you can find in Galatians chapter 1, verses 17 and 18. Joshua spent 40 years as the understudy of Moses, and the disciples spent 3 years following Jesus, and then 40 days after the resurrection for intense training. So realize that God takes time preparing you for whatever is his plan for you. Be patient and listen. Here he is fed by the ravens, bringing bread and meat, and he was able to drink from the brook that was there. Not sure how I would feel eating food brought by birds. Didn't sound like a 5-star restaurant to me. Elisha was obedient. It says, so he did what the Lord told him. There is not a record of Elijah saying, and then what? We'd probably like to see a little further into the future, but God does not work that way. We don't just want to know from A to B. We want to know from A to Z. But God wants to see how obedient we'll be. I wonder what Elijah did all alone for that period of time. Drink some water and then wait for the ravens? Think about it. What do you do when you're alone? No phone, no computer, no books, no TV. Did you ever have the feeling that things could not possibly get worse, and then they did? Well, here we go. But after a while, the brook dried up, for there was no rainfall in the land. Then the Lord said to Elijah, go and live in a village at Zarephath, near the city of Sidon. I have instructed a widow there to feed you. So he went to Zarephath. As he arrived at the gates of the village, he saw a widow gathering sticks, and he asked her, would you please bring me a little cup of water? As she was going to get it, he called to her, bring me a bite of bread, too. See, after a while here, it says maybe a month, maybe a year, we don't know. Then the unexpected happened. When the brook dried up, it's now time to move. Changes happen. Maybe we don't like change. So situations push us to change. In this case, God had something else in mind for Elijah. Little did Elijah realize that his prophecy that it would not rain might affect him. The brook dried up, and he might have said, why me? But now God sends him to a town called Zarephath, a town outside the country of Israel. Here he would see a widow gathering sticks. Notice what he said, would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may drink it? So as she was going to get it, it said he called. I'm thinking maybe he shouted, and bring me, please, a piece of bread. Sounds a little bossy to me. Does this sound familiar with any of your requests? Except yours probably wasn't for water and bread. But you see, he was fishing to see if she was the one he was to find. Remember, she was not a Jew. But she said, I swear by the Lord your God that I don't have a single piece of bread in the house, and I have only a handful of flour left in the jar and a little cooking oil in the bottom of a jug. I was just gathering a few sticks to cook the last meal, and then my son and I will die. But Elijah said to her, don't be afraid. Go ahead and do just what you've said, but make a little bread for me first. Then use what's left to prepare a meal for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. There will always be flour and olive oil left in your containers until the time when the Lord sends rain and the crops grow again. So she did as Elijah said, and she and Elijah and her family continued to eat for many days. There was always enough flour and olive oil left in the containers, just as the Lord had promised through Elijah. You see, she said she had only a little food and was preparing a final meal for her and her son. Elijah told her not to fear, for the flour and the oil would not run out until rain again fell on the land. God would provide. Notice that she was down to her last meal, yet there always seemed had enough for another meal. I wonder if this was like when God supplied manna to the Israelites when they were in the wilderness. They would gather only enough for one day, except over the Sabbath. But the manna kept coming each day anew, and this taught them to rely on God for their daily bread. Sometime later, the woman's son became sick. He grew worse and worse, and finally he died. Then she said to Elijah, O man of God, what have you done to me? Have you come here to point out my sins and kill my son? But Elijah replied, Give me your son. And he took the child's body from her arms, carried him up the stairs to the room where she was staying, and laid the body on his bed. Then Elijah cried out to the Lord, O Lord my God, why have you brought tragedy to this widow who has opened her home to me, causing her son to die? And he stretched himself out over the child 3 times and cried out to the Lord, O Lord my God, please let this child's life return to him. You see, it says here sometime later her son fell ill and finally stopped breathing. Notice how the woman's attitude toward Elijah changed. How often do we change our attitude toward God when things don't go the way we expect? There was plenty of food for a while, and then this happened. But Elijah prayed to God and stretched himself out over the boy, and his life returned to him. The Lord heard Elijah's prayer, and the life of the child returned, and he revived. Then Elijah brought him down from the upper room and gave him to his mother. Look, he said, your son is alive. You see, Elijah was vindicated in her eyes. She said, now I know for sure that you are a man of God and that the Lord truly speaks through you. Not everybody gets vindicated as soon as he did. For some of us, it may not occur till after death. Now we're moving into chapter 18. Later on, in the 3rd year of the drought, the Lord said to Elijah, Go and present yourself to King Ahab. Tell him that I will soon send rain. So Elijah went to appear before Ahab. You see, waiting on God is one of the hardest things in the world to do. Elijah did nothing until God gave him the word. And the next item was a difficult one. After 3 years of hiding, Elijah was to go to Ahab. During this time, Ahab had been hunting for Elijah. It would have been easier to meet Ahab if the rain would have come. But Elijah was to go see Ahab before the rain came. There was still drought and famine in the land. During this time, Jezebel had been killing off hundreds of God's prophets. Some of these prophets went into hiding. And we're going to stop there for part 1. We'll pick up a very important part of Elijah and his experience with God in part 2. So we'll see you next time.